Welcome to the training on guidelines for selection and use of accommodations on state assessments. The topics covered today will include an overview of the Accommodations Guidelines Manual. Updates made to the guidelines for 2025 will be highlighted in this training. We will review the unique accommodations assurance process and updates to the form, as well as frequently used accommodations. Information on online testing and accommodations will be provided. We will also review the supplemental resources available in the accommodations guidelines for the PSSA and Keystone exams. Lastly, we will provide some basic information on other state assessments, including the State Alternate Assessment or the PASA DLM. This training will not cover PASA information in depth, as PASA ACs may find additional information specific to the PASA on the BSE and patent web pages. Effective decision-making about providing students with appropriate accommodations really starts with instruction and making good instructional decisions. Every IEP team member and student instructional team member must be knowledgeable about state and district academic content standards and assessments. Accommodations should always be chosen based upon the student's individual needs and what works for the student during typical instruction and assessment. Accommodation usage should be routinely evaluated and improved as needed. Remember, more is not always better. It's really about choosing the right accommodations. Teams should understand the difference between test features and accommodations. All state tests are universally designed, which means there will be some accessibility features embedded in the test. Student teams need to understand what accessibility features are built in and what may be needed as an accommodation. If the IEP or 504 team determines an accommodation is needed for the student to participate, it must be documented, typically in the student's IEP or 504 plan. We will focus on the Accommodations Guidelines Manual, which is available on the PDE website. Schools must use the accommodations guidelines for full information and details on allowable accommodations for the PSSA and Keystone exams. This webinar is not meant to be a replacement for reading the accommodations guidelines. As mentioned, the guidelines have recently been updated. The 2025 updated manual can be accessed at the link on this slide. What's included in the accommodation guidelines? The guidelines include a highlight of what's new, some general guidance about selecting, implementing, and evaluating accommodations, tables A and B, which give details about the implementation of all available accommodations, and a number of appendices that include additional resources. Starred items will be addressed in further detail in this webinar. Let's review the overall setup of the accommodations tables and some basic information on how to navigate them. Information about individual accommodations can be found in Table A and Table B. Table A is meant to act as a quick guide to all accommodations, and Table B goes into detail about each accommodation use. Each accommodation in Table A links to Table B. Here's a screenshot of Table A from the Accommodations Manual. As you can see, the allowable accommodations are listed in alphabetical order. The table also outlines if particular accommodation is only allowable for a student with an IEP or 504 plan. The third column notes if the accommodation can be a standalone accommodation for English learners. The chart also specifies if the accommodation is available for paper and pencil and/or the online version of the test. Many of the accommodations available for the online version are provided by the online test engine, as outlined in the second to last column. The last column identifies if and when the accommodation requires an electronic assurance to be submitted to PDE. You may find some additional notes in each column to further specify details. This slide provides a screenshot from Table B. As you can see, each allowable accommodation is listed in alphabetical order and can also be accessed by the direct link provided in Table A. This table provides definitions of each accommodation and procedures for use, including how to document the accommodation if necessary.
There are a few changes to the accommodations guidelines for 2025. This table gives an overview of changes made to the accommodations guidelines for 2025. This table can be found before the table of contents in the guidelines. We will provide more detail about each of these changes throughout the presentation. Historically, the audio and read aloud accommodation was only available on the math, science, algebra, biology, and ELA conventions and TDA prompt. Now a separate audio and read aloud accommodation will be available for the full ELA, PSSA, and literature Keystone. This unique accommodation is intended only for a very small number of students who meet the definitions set forth in the accommodations guidelines. This accommodation is intended for a student who is a non-reader, not simply reading below grade level. For this reason, audio or read aloud of the full ELA PSSA literature Keystone will not be appropriate for every student who receives the read aloud or audio of all math, science, and writing items accommodation on the math and science PSSAs and algebra and biology Keystones. Because of the intended construct of the ELA and literature assessments, it is important that only eligible students use the accommodation for a full ELA or literature read aloud. This accommodation is intended for a student who has a disability that precludes the student from accessing printed text. The accommodation must be documented in the IEP or 504 plan and through locally administered diagnostic evaluations and used consistently in classroom instruction and assessment. A student who uses the audio read aloud of the full ELA, PSSA, or literature Keystone accommodation must have a documented disability that severely limits or prevents the student's ability to decode text and derive meaning from text even when repeated and varied evidence-based interventions and instruction are used to teach the student to decode, and only access print materials with a screen reader, audio, a human reader, or other accessible educational materials during classroom instruction and assessment. The embedded audio accommodation should always be considered over using a human reader. Testing with a human reader will increase testing time and create an artificial pace for the student. A student who does not regularly receive this accommodation in the classroom as part of regular instruction and assessment may experience frustration or lack of motivation because of the time and pacing. Human readers may not read aloud all allowable test items for online tests. The paper pencil form must be used. If a human reader is used for the full ELA Keystone literature test, the student must test in a one-on-one environment so that the student has the opportunity to control the pacing of the read aloud. Therefore, unlike using a human reader with math, science, or only the writing items of the ELA PSSA, a student receiving the full read aloud of the ELA or literature assessments may not test in a small group with despiraled books. If using the audio function with headphones, a student may test in a general or small group setting. Please note, audio of the full ELA and literature assessment will be available beginning in spring 2025. Students who need this accommodation for the winter 2024-2025 Keystones may use a human reader. Because the online and paper versions of each test form will no longer be identical, the online audio will no longer match the printed Braille form. Students requiring the paper Braille test and audio will need to utilize a human reader. Another new addition to the accommodations guidelines is the use of a sensory or self-regulation tool. A student who requires an object or tool for sensory and/or self-regulation, also called a fidget, may use a small item during state assessment. The sensory self-regulation tool should not make noise or be a distraction to the student or other students in the room. If the team feels the tool will create a distraction to other students, a separate one-to-one setting must be used. Students may not use a sensory or self-regulation tool that could double as a manipulative or visual aid on the test. For example, a 10 by 10 pop-it grid could be used as a math manipulative, and therefore it may not be used on the test. This section will review unique accommodations and the procedure for submitting a unique accommodation assurance to PDE. The use of unique accommodations were mentioned with Table A. We sometimes get the question, what is considered a unique accommodation? As inferenced in the name, these would be accommodations that are typically used for students who are not otherwise able to access the test material in the traditional way. They are intended for students with an IEP or 504 plan, or those who may be in the formal evaluation process. In order to implement a unique accommodation, the school must follow specific procedures to ensure test security is maintained and the construct of what the test is measuring is not altered or modified. An example might be use of voice to text or speech to text, use of audio or human reader on a test measuring reading, use of an assistive communication device, or the need for scribing on TDA responses. Unique accommodations are easily identified by looking at the last column of Table A in the Accommodations Guidelines. Unique accommodations require an assurance to PDE that the student is eligible for the accommodation and that the school will implement it faithfully. The Keystone PSSA Accommodation Assurance link can be accessed on the PDE website under Accommodations, as well as in the Accommodations Guidelines. The direct link is also provided on this slide. Through the link, the submitter will send the assurance electronically to PDE through a SurveyMonkey submission. The information required in the electronic submission is listed with the instructions in the Accommodations Guidelines. We expect the assurances to be submitted at least 6 weeks prior to the opening of the testing window. Exceptions to the timeline are made for scribing requests due to recent student injury. This process is an assurance rather than an approval. The role of PDE is not to approve or disapprove accommodations that are deemed appropriate by the student's IEP or 504 team. Rather, PDE and the Bureau of Special Education ensure that accommodations are carried out in a manner that maintains test security and test construct. Information submitted in the assurance is subject to further review by PDE and/or the Bureau of Special Education. You will receive a copy of your submission for your records within 5 business days of submission. The assurance form must be kept on file by the SAC, along with a copy of the student's current IEP or 504 plan with the unique accommodation documented. You do not need to submit signatures or the student's IEP or 504 plan to PDE. 2025 unique accommodation assurance submissions are good for 1 school year, including winter 2024-2025 Keystones, spring 2025 PSSAs and Keystones, and summer 2025 Keystones. If any changes need to be made after a form is submitted, please email the Unique Accommodations account. New for 2025, there is no longer a unique accommodation PDF form. The questions that will appear on the electronic submission can be accessed on page 52 of the Accommodations Guidelines. Schools should preview the questions before accessing the electronic link to submit. The Unique Accommodation Confidentiality Agreement previously signed by principals, school assessment coordinators, and test administrators is no longer required. All principals, school assessment coordinators, and test administrators should continue to sign the PSSA or Keystone Test Security Certification. The next portion of this training will include details about frequently used accommodations. This is not an exhaustive list, so please refer to the Accommodations Guidelines for a complete list of accommodations. We talked earlier about the new full read aloud accommodation for ELA. Now let's review the typical read aloud accommodation and various ways it can be used. Read aloud can be used as a test feature or an accommodation. When used as a basic test feature, it is not a pre-planned small group accommodation. The student may ask the teacher to read aloud a word or phrase during the test. It's intended to ensure the measurement of non-reading content is not influenced by a student's inability to decode a word. For example, the student may know how to do math, but cannot decode the word perpendicular. It is permissible to read aloud a word, phrase, sentence, or test item for the math, Algebra 1, science, and biology tests, as well as multiple choice conventions of standard English items and the TDA prompt as requested by the student on the ELA PSSA. Read aloud becomes an accommodation when the student has a documented need. The Read Aloud and Scribing Guidelines Manual provides detailed guidance on reading text aloud for a student. Of note, readers may not clarify, elaborate, paraphrase, assist, or cue a student through their voice inflection. A read aloud accommodation may include reading of all allowable parts by a human reader or the audio feature enabled in the online test. Let's review the various types of read aloud and some considerations the team should make for each. Test directions only. All students will have the test directions read aloud. Any student may ask for the directions to be repeated. Some math, science, and writing items at student request. All students may ask for a word, phrase, or question to be read aloud on the math and science PSSAs, biology and algebra keystones, and on the TDA or conventions of standard English sections of the ELA PSSA. If a student is anticipated to use this accommodation frequently, it may be helpful to place the student in a small group. All math, science, and writing items. A student with documented need may have the entire math and science PSSAs, biology and algebra keystones, and the TDA or Conventions of Standard English sections of the ELA PSSA read aloud. There should be no more than 5 students in a group if using a human reader. In this case, test booklets need to be despiraled. Students testing online may use headphones for audio and may not need to test in a small group. Read aloud for full ELA test. As mentioned before, this accommodation is now available only for students meeting the requirements in the accommodations guidelines. One-to-one testing and a unique accommodation assurance form are required. Remember that the full ELA, PSSA, or Literature Keystone Read Aloud or audio is for students who cannot access text in any other way. The read aloud of math, science, and writing items can be used by any student who shows documented need with the intention of ensuring the measurement of content is not influenced by the student's inability to read the test. Therefore, students using the read aloud or audio of math, science, and writing items may not be eligible for the full read aloud or audio of the ELA or literature assessment. Read aloud for the full ELA, PSSA, or Keystone Literature Assessment is the only read aloud accommodation that requires a unique accommodations assurance form. The assistance with selecting a response accommodation is intended for students who are unable to physically select multiple choice answers, including technology enhanced items, due to disability or injury. This accommodation must occur in a one-to-one setting, and the TA can in no way prompt, cue, or influence the student's response. On the paper pencil test, the TA may mark the multiple choice response at the student's direction in the answer booklet or combined test answer booklet. As the PSSA and Keystone tests move online and technology enhanced items are added to the test, students may need assistance in completing certain item types. For the online test, a TA may respond to an item at a student's direction if a student's motor or visual disability does not allow them to complete the task. For example, if a student cannot manipulate a drop-down box, the TA opens the drop-down box and the student tells the TA which item to choose. Students can practice responding to multiple choice and TE items in the online tools training. If a student has difficulty independently responding to TE items due to a visual or motor disability, an accommodated form can be made available by contacting the Unique Accommodations email account. Another accommodation students use is scribing. Schools must follow the read aloud and scribing guidelines when using a scribing accommodation of any kind. Scribing is allowable for students with physical disability or injury that severely limits the motor process of writing, typing, or recording responses. Scribing is also allowable for students who have a documented disability in written expression, which interferes with their ability to write or key responses. In these cases, if the student is using scribing on the state assessment, they must also use scribing on a day-to-day basis for instruction and assessment. The IEP 504 educational team determined that scribing or dictation is essential for student access to the test. The online test version is recommended as this allows students the greatest level of independence. Individual students can take the online test even if the rest of the school population is testing paper pencil. Not all scribing accommodations are considered a unique accommodation that requires an assurance submission to PDE. You only need to submit the unique accommodation assurance for grades 4 through 8 ELA TDA responses because it measures writing. It is not necessary to submit a unique accommodation assurance for Keystone Literature, Algebra and Biology, PSSA Math and Science, or the grade 3 PSSA ELA. With any scribing accommodation, unique or not, the appropriate bubble or online checkbox must be marked to indicate the student received a scribing accommodation. Test administrators reading aloud any allowable part of the test or scribing any open-ended part of the test must follow the read aloud and scribing guidelines for operational assessments. One unique accommodation that we often receive questions on is the voice-to-text or speech-to-text accommodation. This is when the student can say their answer aloud and the app or software dictates their response into text. This is often used for students who have difficulty writing their responses due to a disability or injury. The use of a voice-to-text accommodation does require submission of the unique accommodation assurance. It should only be used in cases where the student is not able to complete the assessment by any other means. The school team must ensure the technology parameters to lock down the student laptop or device are followed. This oftentimes necessitates working with your IT department ahead of time to ensure the laptop or tablet can be locked down properly during assessment. The device used must be school issued or school approved. When using a voice to text app or software, the test administrator must transcribe the student's response verbatim into the test booklet or type it into the online version of the test. Again, the device must be properly locked down during testing. As mentioned, you may need your IT department to assist with restricting the device according to the guidelines in the Accommodations Manual. Next, we will review the state concussion policy. The school must have medical documentation within 2 weeks of the start of the current testing window, stating the student may not participate. In these cases, the student would be coded as a recent medical emergency with the proper documentation kept in the student record. If the school does not have medical documentation, the student should be coded as other. However, marking other will have a negative impact on the school's participation rate. This slide outlines accommodations for English learners. It is allowable to use word-to-word translation dictionaries without definitions and without pictures for the PSSA Math, Keystone Algebra 1, PSSA Science, and Keystone Biology only. The word-to-word dictionaries are not to be used for any part of the PSSA ELA and Keystone Literature exams. A qualified interpreter or site translator may be used for PSSA Math, Keystone Algebra 1, PSSA Science, and Keystone Biology only, not for any part of the Keystone Literature exam or PSSA ELA test except for the TDA prompt. Guidelines for choosing an interpreter can be found in the EL Accommodations Guidelines. Spanish versions of the PSSA Math and Science, Keystone Algebra 1, and Keystone Biology exams can be used. New for 2025, schools may pre-translate and print any non-secure assessment materials for students using the school's typical translation method. This includes documents like formula sheets, open-ended rubrics, and directions from the Directions for Administration. A complete list of items that may be translated can be found in the 2025 EL Accommodations Guidelines. The test itself may not be pre-translated and printed for students. Other accommodations may be used for English learners. See the column for EL learners in Table A in the General Accommodations Guidelines. For more information on English learner participation in state assessments, please see the Accommodations Guidelines for ELs. Small groups of 1 to 5 students must be used for reading aloud, signing, or translation of all math, algebra, science, biology, multiple choice conventions of standard English items, and the TDA prompt. Remember, a human read aloud of all allowable test items sets an artificial pace, and some students may be reluctant to ask the TA to slow down or repeat the question in a group setting. If the student is using the online version, this accommodation can be implemented through the audio feature selected ahead of time. The student can simply use a set of headphones and navigate the read aloud themselves. They do not need to be in a small group if using this option. When read alouds are conducted in small groups, test booklets may need to be despiraled. Despiraling the test forms is a special exception that must be documented and may not be done by the test administrator. Only test coordinators are permitted to despiral test booklets. Despiraling is only appropriate when all test items must be read aloud and only in a small group setting under 5 students. Small groups of 1 to 12 students can be used for students who require a separate setting to reduce distractions, provide scheduled extended time, or provide a read aloud for some allowable test items. For any accommodation where a student's responses are verbalized aloud, as well as the full ELA or literature read aloud, a 1-to-1 setting must be used. The next accommodation is enlarged print and magnification. The enlarged print test can be ordered from DRC for the paper pencil PSSA Keystone exams. They appear at an 18-point Arial font. CCTV, handheld, and desk models of magnifiers are allowable to use with the paper pencil exams. For online, everything appears at 12-point Arial font. The test automatically enlarges to fit an oversized monitor screen. The zoom function on a student's device still functions with the test engine. In addition, the online tools include a magnifier. Use the online test tutorial to determine if the online test items are suitable for your student.
Next, we will talk about online testing. In the spring, the governor announced a move to all online testing by spring of 2026. Paper pencil testing will still be available for the 24-25 school year and the winter Keystones for 25-26. However, we encourage LEAs to begin moving toward online testing now. LEAs who are still testing 100% paper pencil may start by moving a specific grade or subject online. In the spring of 2026, all schools will be required to test online. Exceptions will be made for students who have a documented need for a paper pencil test in their IEP or 504 plan. As outlined on some of the previous slides, there are many benefits to using the online version of the test, especially for students who may require certain accommodations. The online version enables more independence. For example, a student who needs a read aloud can simply use a set of headphones at a computer using the audio feature of the online test rather than having a person read aloud to them in a small group or a one-on-one testing situation. The online version provides tools such as highlighters, color chooser, and sticky notes. The online version guarantees the standardized provision of some accommodations and provides a digital format that may be more appealing to some students. In the online version, the student or the TA is able to enlarge the test page to fit an oversized monitor. Therefore, the font can more easily be adjusted to the exact size the student needs. For ELA, it eliminates managing two booklets. You can choose to use the online version for individuals, small groups, or your entire class or school. When an embedded online accommodation, such as audio or color chooser, is selected for a student in eDirect, the accommodation will appear on the student's test ticket. If it doesn't appear on the ticket, it is not turned on. Online Training Tools offers practice opportunities for students to become familiar with the tools available in the online testing platform. Students can practice with audio and color chooser accommodations by choosing the accommodated form. Students can also practice with embedded tools including magnification, highlighter, masking, line guides, and notes. It's important for students to practice using the online tools prior to using them during the assessments. When determining a student's assessment accommodation needs, it may be helpful to evaluate the student's ability to use the online training tools. The tools can be found at the link on this slide. Next, we will review some supplemental resources included in the Accommodations Guidelines Manual. The last section of the Accommodations Guidelines contains several useful tools for teachers and teams to use when determining appropriate accommodations. Schools are encouraged to use these tools to better help students, parents, and school team members to select appropriate accommodations that will be most meaningful to the student. Some of these tools can be used as documentation of accommodations for students who are in the process of being evaluated for an IEP or 504. There are resources available for low incidence disabilities, such as blind and visually impaired and deaf and hard of hearing. Access the links on this slide for Braille item samplers. Also, a refreshable Braille option is available for the online test engine, which is compatible with JAWS. You may contact DRC for more information. The last section of today's module will touch upon accommodation resources specific to other assessments, such as the PA alternate assessment or the PASA DLM. This section also addresses accommodations for the CDT and new Firefly benchmark available this fall. PDE offers two optional online assessments to help teachers measure student progress. The CDT is designed to provide information about a student's areas of need and strengths to build upon. The new Firefly benchmark, available this fall, is designed to measure end-of-year grade level learning goals. After the initial pilot year, the benchmark will provide a predictor for PSSA and Keystone performance. Online training tools are available for the CDT and will be available for the Firefly benchmark. PDE does not regulate accommodations on the CDT or Firefly because these are meant to be classroom tools and do not contain secure materials. However, Offering an accommodation for CDT or Firefly that is not available on the summative assessment may alter the intended construct of the test and the accompanying data. It's important that the IEP team understand the CDT and Firefly test construct when determining test accommodations. Because of the adaptive nature of these tests, some embedded accommodations, like refreshable braille or audio, may not be available. The PASA DLM is the state alternate assessment designed only for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities who meet all 6 of the state's PASA eligibility criteria. A link to the state's PASA eligibility criteria is provided on this slide. Accommodations specific to this assessment can be accessed in the PASA DLM Accessibility Manual. Please use the contacts on this slide for any questions regarding testing accommodations. Note the email address for unique accommodations should be used for any questions about the state assessment accommodations or unique accommodations. Please do not submit your unique accommodation assurance to this address, as these must be submitted through the link provided. Thank you for your participation in this training.